Buenos días. A nombre del Centro de Estudios de Conflicto y Cohesión Social, damos la bienvenida al seminario Claves para debatir el proceso constituyente, a cargo de Tom Ginsburg, doctor en Jurisprudencia y Políticas Sociales de la Universidad de California. Actualmente, Ginsburg es profesor de Derecho Constitucional e Internacional y de Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Chicago. También dirige el Comparative Constitutions Project, institucionalidad financiada por la National Science Foundation con el objetivo de recopilar y analizar las constituciones de todos los Estados-nación independientes desde el año 1789. Ginsburg, previo a sus labores de docencia, ejerció como asesor legal de juicio oral en Estados Unidos, en la Corte Internacional de La Haya, en Holanda, y continuó trabajando con diversas agencias internacionales y gobiernos extranjeros en reformas legales y constitucionales. Inicialmente, este seminario iba a ser comentado por la académica Pamela Figueroa y moderado por Claudia Hayes. Sin embargo, ambas son parte de la mesa técnica de la oposición a cargo de la redacción de la reforma constitucional. Por tal motivo, los comentarios quedaron a cargo del investigador Coes, Javier Coes, quien es profesor titular de Derecho Constitucional de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad de Diego Portales y titular de la cátedra Príncipe Claus en Desarrollo y la Equidad de la Universidad de Utrecht, Holanda. Coes es abogado de la Universidad Católica de Chile, doctor en Jurisprudencia y Política Social por la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Actualmente se desempeña como miembro asociado de la Academia Internacional de Derecho Comparado, luego de haber estado en el Comité Ejecutivo de la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional. Su trabajo se centra en el derecho constitucional comparado y en el estudio de judicialización de la política, con énfasis en la interacción entre constitucionalismo, Estado de Derecho y cultura jurídica en las nuevas democracias. Para iniciar este seminario, dejo con ustedes, en representación de Coes, al investigador principal del centro y profesor titular de la Universidad de Diego Portales, Alfredo Ñoñán, quien dará unas palabras de bienvenida.
Bien, buenos días a todos y a todas. Constanza ya dio las excusas por la ausencia de Pamela Figueroa y Claudia Hayes, quienes están desempeñando un rol entre decisivo y patriótico a estas alturas, y además muy difícil por lo que nos hemos informado por la prensa. Bueno, gracias por asistir a un evento tan relevante como este, y a un evento organizado un poco en la emergencia, lo que nos coloca un poco a la altura de la coyuntura de la crisis social y el momento constituyente en el que nos encontramos. A nombre del board de Coes y de todo su equipo directivo, quiero agradecer muy sinceramente el tiempo y el interés de Tom Ginsburg por acompañarnos hoy, además de su pasión por los cambios constitucionales comparados, de los cuales es un reconocido estudioso y especialista. Como lo decía Constanza, Tom Ginsburg es Leo Spitz Professor de Derecho Internacional, además de ser profesor de Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Chicago en Estados Unidos. Actualmente codirige el proyecto sobre constituciones comparadas, junto a Zachary Elkins de la Universidad de Texas en Austin, en Estados Unidos, y James Melton del University College London del Reino Unido. Su último libro es How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, Cómo salvar una democracia constitucional, escrito junto a Hasik Hook y publicado por University of Chicago Press en el 2018. Entiendo, Tom, que estuviste en Chile hace un puñado de meses y de cambio de constitución en aquel entonces no había nada, ni pistas, ni voluntades, ni menos sospechas. Meses después, hoy, el cambio es casi un hecho. La Constitución de 1980 fue objeto de eutanasia entre gallos y medianoche, en una oscura calle del Barrio Alto, e inevitablemente nos acercamos a una nueva Constitución, salvo que el pueblo, en el próximo mes de abril, diga otra cosa, lo que francamente sería sorprendente. Nuevamente, Tom, if I may, muchas gracias por haber venido a ayudarnos a entender lo que para muchos en Chile era un sueño, para muchos otros una pesadilla, y para varios otros más una fuente de indiferencia, y eso es el cambio de una constitución. A partir de ahora, la pregunta es ¿qué se juega en este tipo de circunstancias tan excepcionales? ¿Qué cabe esperar y qué ventajas y límites se encuentran contenidos en los dos mecanismos que prontamente serán plebiscitados? Tom, the time is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you to everyone for coming here. When I come to Chile, I like to say that I'm from the University of Chicago, but I'm from the other side of the University of Chicago. And I, of course, have had some interest in Chile for some time. My perspective here is one of a humble outsider, but as someone who has studied constitutions all over the world and how they are made and what is in them and how they operate, what makes them actually effective. And so I want to offer my reflections at this moment, at this historic juncture of Chile's political life. As was said, this is my second visit just this year. I was here in July. And everything is different. Physically, driving over here, I saw graffiti basically everywhere, which wasn't here before. But also, just at 1 a.m. last night when I was coming in the taxi, there was a lot of there was discussion about the Constitutional Convention, the news, and such. So it seems to be a major issue now, finally, after so long. It is so let me just say that looking around the world, new constitutions are written in many different kinds of situations. Sometimes you get a new constitution after a true revolution. Tunisia or some of these Arab Spring countries tried to really change the entire political system, and in Tunisia's case, they actually did produce a new constitution. I might say Nepal might be another recent example. In some countries, you get a new constitution after a civil war as part of a peace agreement, a peace pact. In some countries, you have kind of what we'd say is a transition from authoritarianism, but a pact, an agreed transition from authoritarianism. And maybe the conventional case here is Spain in the 1970s, when there was a kind of agreement to return power to the people, if you will. Sometimes constitutions are just unilateral reforms by one party that's maybe trying to calm things down without making a major social change. Cuba's made some major reforms this year, for example. Sometimes constitutions move in an authoritarian direction. Hungary is a backsliding democracy, which was a democracy and now is slipping away. And the constitution became a tool of one party to consolidate its power, they hope, forever. And sometimes constitutions are just very technical, moderate reforms. So Sweden, which is one of the most boring countries in the world, changed its constitution, had a whole new one in 1974, just to make some technical changes after a couple hundred years. So they're written in many, many different kinds of situations. I should add one other category, which is occupation. In Iraq or post-war Japan, the constitution was imposed, or at least the process was imposed from outside, in order to give a new birth to the society. So many, many different kinds of situations. I think of Chile's 1980 constitution as being a very distinct kind of constitution. And it's one that I called, in some work I wrote, a transformational authoritarian constitution. It's a very small category. There's very few like this. Actually, one other country with a constitution like that is Panama, which is just now also changing its constitution this year, quite interestingly. But that model is one where you have basically an authoritarian regime that wants to return power to a democratic process, but only in a bounded way. There are certain issues which are off the limits and which will be kept into the constitution after the authoritarian regime goes away. And those constitutions have very specific institutional structures to preserve the power, to preserve some interests of the old elite, a veto of the authoritarian leaders, and those are very well known to everyone in Chile, I think, quite well known. It's been the central drama of the 1980 Constitution, is the gradual evolution or withering away of those institutional constraints, and it's taken a generation or more, 40 years. And that's what you have been doing. 40 years is a long time for a constitution to last in any country. One of the things that my colleagues and I showed is that if you look at all countries around the world since 1789, the predicted lifespan of a national constitution is only 19 years. Most constitutions do not last. So a constitution that lasts a generation or a generation and a half has done its work. And it can be considered a success by the people who wrote it. But that being said, there also comes a time when the society changes enough that you must do some reforms. And so when I think about Chile today, I think about just as the 1980 Constitution was kind of a model for a transformational authoritarian constitution, now Chile again has the opportunity to do something, to make a contribution globally to our understanding of constitutions because of the situation. It's not an occupation. It's not a revolution. It's not a pacted transition from authoritarianism. It's not many of those categories that I mentioned before, but rather it's the question, in an ongoing democracy, can you have a new constitution that provides a new basis, new social basis for the society, to motivate it and to deliver people the kind of governance they want? And it's an open question. We're going to find out. But I think it's an opportunity, but of course it's also a great challenge. The bridge is narrow. It's a hard road to go from here. Having looked at the agreement for social peace in the new constitution, I'll be talking quite specifically about it and the challenges that it lays out for us. But I guess I just want to start by saying, by framing the problem as one with great potential, but also one with great challenges. The way I'm going to proceed is I want to first talk about the assets and the liabilities, or the assets and the constraints in this constitution-making situation. Every constitution-making situation has some assets and some constraints that it's operating under. And so what's the situation here in comparative perspective? Then I want to talk about some of the very concrete questions. Who should write a new constitution? How will that be done? What is the process, the actual process? Particularly, what is the role of the people in participating in the constitution-making process? And then I will say a little bit about what might go into the Constitution. Just some vague thoughts. It's not my role, obviously, to determine. That will be the Chilean political process and the Chilean people's process. But looking at the demands from the society, what might be done? What kinds of things should they be looking at, considering at this moment? So that's my plan. Let me start with the assets and constraints. So I think the situation right now has many strong assets, many good things, which bode well for completing a constitution-making process. In the first place, we have tremendous social demand and agreement that there should be a new constitution. At least the poll numbers that I saw said something like 80% of Chileans would like a new constitution. Well, that's a good deal of consensus. And we'll see in the April vote. Who knows? April is a long time away. But still, I think that's a big asset. It's not that there's major disagreement on that question. There's also, of course, the roadmap as set in the agreement on social peace. So we know the steps. And of course, it sets forward a 2-year process, which is probably a realistic timeline, but still, it's hard to write a new constitution. 2 years is maybe about the minimum amount of time it would take. You also have, of course, a functioning party system in this country. And I think that's actually a major asset. Generally speaking, when we look around the world and study backsliding countries whose democracy is declining, like Hungary I mentioned, or Poland, or Turkey or something like that, Those countries have something in common. I would add actually Venezuela in the 1990s. Those countries all have something in common, which is the existing party system had collapsed. And in that void, we like to think, oh, you know, the people would speak directly. But the problem is, in a void of political parties, sometimes a demagogue can come forward, very, very often. And so it's actually a dangerous thing to have a no-party system. Now, political parties are not popular around the world. We're in an era where people distrust political parties in many countries, but we have not, in our consideration of democratic technology, come up with an alternative to them as a way of channeling participation in an ordinary way. And I will talk about some of the very interesting experiments in participation around the world, using new technology and such, but still, parties are essential, and you have a party system, and that's a good thing, I think. What else is an asset? Well, of course, you have intellectual resources. There's Chilean scholars, my commentator, many other around the country are have a lot of experience and knowledge. And so that's really great. Plus an educated citizenry, more or less, that can understand in broad outline what constitutions are about. So this is a really great asset, and it's not found in many, many other countries. Finally, of course, you have Chile's long constitutional history. And we're at a big juncture in that history because this is, of course, the first time a new constitution will be produced as a matter of public demand, not as a matter of elite gift to the society. And that's a wonderful opportunity. But at the same time, that long history of constitutional stability, of the rule of law, is an asset, in my view, because it's very hard to build. And many countries around the world are searching for how you get that when you don't have it. So if you have it, you should consider it an asset. It actually comes into play in constitution-making processes because sometimes you get to situations of deadlock, of the parties who are negotiating just won't agree. And, you know, you need an outside force sometimes to police them, to say, no, this is what the rule was, you have to do this, you have to do that, just to follow the procedures of the constitution-making roadmap. So in some countries, courts play that role. And that is some sense a possibility here in Chile, though, of course, the agreement doesn't say anything about courts. But I think thinking about the rule of law as an asset to help guide you through this narrow bridge is a helpful thing. Constraints. Constraints are not, usually in English we say assets versus liabilities. Liability is a bad thing, assets is a good thing. I would like to talk about liabilities, but there are certain constraints here, and those things will affect the process. Constraints are, and let me just say, even though we like to think of the Constitution as the most fundamental expression of the people, constitutions are always made within constraints. There's always some limit on the process, legal limit or political limit. And one major constraint, of course, is the street, if I can use the term, the people. The people will, of course, have a referendum at the end of the process if it goes forward after April, and that's a constraint. And so everything that happens before is done in light of that final voice of the people. But it's also the case that in a moment now when you have the mobilized people, then they are a constraint in terms of their demands. And one of the things that I'll say a little more about is how to channel that energy of the people into the process as opposed to, going outside of it, so that the constitution-making process really does channel the energy and is not just a sideshow. But these demands of the people are a real constraint. The timeline, of course, set out in the Agreement for Social Peace is also a constraint. Now that all the parties have agreed, that's what will be followed. But as I will talk about, of course, it's very vague, and you probably are having discussions about some of the details that are needed to actually put some meat on that skeleton. A final constraint I will mention is that you lack a unifying figure, a unifying person. In many constitution-making situations, South Africa, the United States, even France in 1958. You have a single person who kind of is above the fray, who can stand above and can help the ordinary political forces to break deadlocks, a unifying human. And Chile, of course, doesn't have that. It's a time of ordinary political processes with ordinary politicians. No leader to guide you across this bridge. And that's a challenge, because it means that there's the possibility of the people leading us across the bridge fighting with each other and taking the whole society falling off the bridge into the water. All right, so that's the situation. Generally speaking, a lot of assets. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons to think that this will be or can be a successful process. But much will depend, of course, on the issues of who is involved, how they are doing it, and what they decide. And let me now turn to those topics. First of all, who should write a constitution? Generally speaking, around the world, there are three large models in democracies. One is to have a legislature write the new constitution or make the reforms through the ordinary process stipulated in the Constitution, the amendment process. And actually, it's interesting that Panama, which I mentioned before, which is also undergoing some of the same pressures, had street demonstrations, and now is reforming the Constitution, is doing it through the ordinary legislature. It's a very typical way to do it. A second way is to have a special constituent assembly that only is resolving the constitutional questions, and that's, of course, what is laid out in your agreement. And a third is to have a body which is doing both at the same time. And this turns out to be the most common way nowadays. When you have a new constitution that's going to be written in any kind of crisis, the default answer is let's set up a constituent assembly that will also act as the legislature. And that's typically found in situations where there's been a break in the legitimacy of the prior legal order. Now, what's the advantage and disadvantage of each of those? The legislature, of course, has some advantages because it ensures legal continuity, the continuity of legitimacy of the process, but it has some disadvantages. And there's a great fear in the literature, in the academic literature, there's a fear that if you let the legislature write the Constitution, they will be thinking about their own political position exclusively and not thinking about the whole society. Indeed, in a situation like this, one of the reasons you have demand for the Constitution is because the legislative process isn't working. So it's not an option. So turning to the other ones, what about the dual purpose body, which, as I said, is the most common? South Africa, Nepal, Tunisia. These are very successful bodies that were running not only the ordinary politics, but also writing the Constitution. One thing about that model is you might say that if you have a body that's doing both jobs, the day-to-day work of running the society and writing the Constitution, they might not have the capacity to do both. Writing a Constitution is a full-time job, and it's very complicated. And so if you're also doing ordinary legislation, well, maybe it might be rather difficult. You also might have some, and by the way, a common feature of those is that it takes a long time. In Nepal, for example, it took them 8 years of their constituent assembly to write the new constitution because they just couldn't agree on things and there wasn't the great pressure, and they were dealing with ordinary legislation. The other thing about that model is it can lead to sort of trade-offs across issues. I'll give you this in the Constitution if you give me this in the ordinary budget. And if you think about it from a sort of normative perspective, we really want the Constitution to be its own product, its own standalone process, I think. The ordinary citizens would like that in general. So I think the model you've chosen of having a pure designated constituent assembly is appropriate for this particular situation. It gives a lot of profile to the process. It allows the participants to focus. And the one danger with this model in other countries is actually dealt with in your agreement. So in some other countries, when you create a special constituent assembly, the thought is this is what we say in French, the pouvoir constituant. This is the people. This is the voice of the people, which of course in sort of democratic theory can never be constrained. So sometimes you have a move where people say, well, we're the Constituent Assembly. We can do anything we want. We can not only just write the Constitution, we can now exercise normal power. And this was the move, of course, of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela when he lost the National Assembly election. He said, fine, we're going back to the Constituente. The people, no one can stop the people, we'll just do everything through that. And that's what's turned Venezuela into a dictatorship. Now, of course, this risk is not present in Chile because of the fifth provision of your agreement on social peace, which says that this is just a body for writing the Constitution. It is a constituted power, is what we would say technically. It's not itself constituent, able to change everything outside the scope of its mission, and so that's its job. And so I see little risk of it expanding beyond that. And so in a way, it's quite a good model. Now, when I look around the world at these different models, it's interesting that when you look at the actual output of the Constitution on many dimensions, number of rights, amount of legislative power, democratic quality, we don't actually see much difference. Whether you write it through a legislature, you write it through a constituent assembly, or write it through what I'd call a legislative constituent assembly, constituent legislature that's doing both jobs. In the end, what goes into the Constitution, in the end, is more determined, and this is a summary of my general finding. If you want to know what's in a country's constitution, the much more important thing than to know the process is to know when it was written and where it was written. What era, what year, and what region. Regions, of course, have there are trends within regions, sort of common thinking within a region that sometimes means that countries reform in similar ways on many dimensions, including constitutions. And the era is particularly important. Constitutions are like technology. They're changing all the time. And just as any rational person would not use a technology from 1787, so people writing constitutions today will, come up with the latest things that are found and that have been tried in other countries and tested. And so that means when you're looking around, you're going to be looking around at today's ideas. No one is going to copy the American Constitution of 1787, which, by the way, it isn't working very well for us, if you did not notice. Now, so that means that these processes may be less important than at the macro level than the details. But here I think we do come to a difference, because the way in which you choose the people who are writing the Constitution will have a great difference, maybe not on the final outcome, but on the probability of success, the probability of crossing the bridge. There have been essentially a number of different models. And I want to now talk a little bit about Iceland, if I can. Iceland is a very small country. There's less people than in this district of Santiago de Chile, 350,000 people. After their great financial crisis in 2011, I guess it was, there was a massive set of street demonstrations. They called the Revolution of Pots and Pans, because the ordinary people were coming out and banging their pots outside the parliament, demanding a social change. Not dissimilar from Chile. It wasn't violent, though. There was no violence. And the political system decided that we have to do something. And so there was agreement that they would try to draft a constitution in a new way. And they set up a model which tried to exclude ordinary politicians. And so I call this the anti-politics model of forming a constituent convention or a constitutional convention. It's pretty interesting what they did, and some of these things are very attractive. First, they had a random selection of 950 Icelandic citizens from the phone book and got them together to generate ideas. What do you want? What should we be doing? And then they consolidated those ideas. They had some experts consolidate those ideas. And then they had a special election for a constitution-making body of 25 Icelanders. The only rule is they could not be a member of a political party or an officer in a political party. And they came up with a very diverse set of Icelanders, and they went and they began to draft. And they came up with some very radical ideas and some very participatory ideas. And then, when they were finished, there was an advisory referendum by the people on their product, and the people said they liked most of it. They rejected one thing. Now, that draft, of course, though, in order to become part of the law, had to go through the ordinary legislature. And that's where it stopped. 6 months later, there was an election. The Icelanders voted in some political parties, and those parties did not adopt the new constitution. What can we take from this lesson? I think there's some great ideas about participation, but to me it suggests that you can't totally bypass existing political structures if you've got them. There's sort of sometimes a dream of the people speaking purely in a kind of anti-politics intuition. That's a feature of our era, that politics are somehow dirty. But you really, in the end, cannot avoid the established institutions. And so far better to have a model that engages them. I actually think that the model of Mexico City's new constitution was a quite interesting one, which was adopted in 2017. In that one, they also started with getting ordinary people to present their ideas. They then had a system where they had a body very much like what you're talking about in Chile. There was a specially designated body, but it would be partly formed by the special election and partly formed by designated politicians from the legislature, from the president, appointees of the president. It was a mixed body of existing institutions and a specially elected people who were mostly politicians, some independents, but mostly politicians. And that was the body that did the actual drafting. One of the things I liked about that model is they had very novel ways of being open to the public the entire time. So any citizen of Mexico City who had an idea for something that should be considered could put it online. They had an online platform. And if they got the support of 10,000 people, then they could meet with a member with this special constitutional convention. If they got the support of 50,000 people, they got to meet the mayor himself, whose idea the whole thing was. And that led to kind of an ongoing discussion where there was input all the way through. And that turns out to be have been a successful model, in my view, and is something that I think is considered. Because if in April you decide on the option of the mixed model, then you might be able to sort of supplement it. First of all, that's not a bad model. It worked in Mexico City. Secondly, it might supplement the existing. You might find ways to supplement the input to make sure that the people are involved. One last thing about forming these bodies. A general trend in governance generally, but also in constitution making, is ensuring the voices of marginalized people. How do we do that? Well, let's just start with the idea of having more women involved in constitution making. And there has been a trend around the world to try to do this in various ways. mostly through the way that will occur here in Chile, which, as I understand, is just using the existing system with your existing quota, where parties have to have a certain number of female candidates. That's been successful in many ways. Certainly the rate of female legislators in Chile has been going up since the adoption, though there might be ways to increase that number even more. And one thing that is done in many systems is to have a constitutional election, but with special seats for other marginalized groups: the disabled, the youth, the elderly, the Mapuche. You could imagine a system where you would do something like that. And actually, this gets I guess today, the Technical Commission is coming up with rules for what the Constituent Assembly will do. But I would think that there might be the possibility, one could think about some possibility of special seats for non-voting members, or some monitors from these various sectors, so that we're assured that it's very broad. That would be certainly consistent with many trends. Okay, I now want to turn, if I can, a little more to the how. I've already touched a little bit on this, but we've said who's going to write it. Now how? And here, some of the things I will say are really rather technical, but they come out from experience of other countries. So when we say how, the real question then is, what are going to be the procedures in the Constitutional Convention, right? What procedures will they use? Where will they do it? How will they do it? And there's many small decisions of procedure which seem really boring, the kind of thing only lawyers would be interested in, but turn out to make a big difference. Do you have committees for different subject matters, or does everyone debate everything? How do you internally divide up the work? How do you organize the timeline? I see a couple things which I think might be of general public interest. First of all, is there going to be a single draft of the Constitution? In South Africa, which was a very difficult negotiation between parties that just hated each other, they decided that they were going to have a single working draft of the Constitution, and then they would bracket the issues on which there was disagreement. So they came up quickly with a broad outline, and most things were actually agreed on. And then they put off the issues which were the most difficult. This was a good thing in that context, because the parties really didn't trust each other at all. And by at least coming up with some areas of agreement, they could show some momentum, and they could build some trust across the aisle. And they put off the most difficult issues to the end. One of the things that they did, and is now very common, and I don't see in your agreement, is to put forward at some point a public draft. A draft before the final one goes to referendum. A sort of midway through, this is what we're thinking about, let's take comments on it. And that is something that is advisable, I think. Because suppose you negotiate all these things and there's some little technical problem that people notice later on that could have been fixed quite easily after it's put to the public, and you've missed an opportunity. So that's a decision that must be made. Internal decisions about staffing. How do you communicate, if you're the constituent convention, with the public? How do you keep the public informed about the work? And finally, I want to say about the voting rule. The voting rule. Now, again, I'm an outsider, and this might be ignorant, but as I read that agreement, I see at least a suggestion that every provision has to have a 2/3 support of the Constituent Convention in order to get in. And I worry very much that they might proceed by going provision by provision and voting on each individual institution one at a time. Why do I worry about that? Constitutions are not just a set of institutions randomly thrown together. They are systems. They work as a whole. and they have dynamics that are internal to them. So, if you're proceeding one institution or one sort of article at a time, you have the risk of incompatible provisions. Suppose, for example, that they decide that, the president can disband the legislature. And they vote on that, and that gets a 2/3 vote. Suppose they also decide that the legislature can impeach the president, and that gets a 2/3 vote. Now you have a system in which both sides are going to be at war immediately, even though both things sound good from some sort of accountability perspective. So thinking about these systemically is really important. And the Constitutional Convention has to decide basically what is the unit on which they're going to vote. If it's political system, rights provisions, so on, or is it each individual article? And there's no natural answer to those questions. So it's really going to take, at the end, a kind of consensus, and there is a risk of incoherence. Now, I think, of course, the way the discussion that I'm following analyzes that question says, no problem. If they don't agree on 2/3, it will just be a matter for ordinary law down the road. But the problem with that is that there are certain things which must be in a constitution, which should be in a constitution. And if some political party thinks that they're going to win the next election, they might want to push things to the ordinary politics, the ordinary legislation. They might want to stop having an agreement, or they might want to refuse to agree in order to let ordinary legislation solve the problem. And again, that's fine for many things, but certain things cannot. There are certain things which a constitution just has to answer. What is the quorum on the first meeting of the legislature? Who is the chair of the first legislative session? What is the date on which the president takes over? You can't, after an election, if you don't have those answers, there's going to be a lot of fighting. So I worry a little bit about that, and I would like to be very interested to hear your perspective on if that's a real risk or not. Well, I'm talking a lot, but I have a couple other things I have to say. And I want to turn back to this question about participation and the role of the public. In general, participation is a good thing, and you want to somehow find a way to sustain the interests of the people in the process. It's going to take 2 years. That's a long time. If the vote in April is successful, it'll be the end of 2021 before a constitution is adopted, possibly. And that's hard. In general, there's a norm now around the world that to the extent possible, the people should be involved in constitution making. That wasn't true 50 years ago. It was easy to do deals behind closed doors, coffee shops, I guess you say, cafes. But now the people have to be involved. But then the question is how? There's a great professor in our field, Jan Elster, and he had the idea that participation should be like an hourglass, It should be very wide at the very beginning of the process, but then it must narrow. There must be a period when the parties can negotiate sort of in secret, in private, behind closed doors, and so that they can actually come up to an agreement, that they can bargain. It's very hard to do a bargain in public. When things are transparent, people tend to just be talking mostly to the audience outside rather than to each other to come up with the agreement. So Elster's idea is a lot of public at the beginning, then you narrow down and there's some political agreement, and then again it gets wide, and the public must be involved at the end to bless the process in a kind of a referendum or something like that. And I think that's an attractive model. But as I say, there are ways to ensure public input throughout. So the public, of course, can be involved in constitutions in many ways. They can select who is drafting. That seems likely to happen. They can provide ideas. I gave the example of Mexico City and Iceland, where the people were involved at the beginning, and in Mexico City all the way through in making suggestions. They can look at drafts and of course they can approve the final product. And I think that those are all good roles. I would like to add one other one, which is the public is sometimes necessary when there is a deadlock in the constitutional bargaining. Suppose the parties go behind the closed doors and they just can't agree on some fundamental issue. Sometimes we are now seeing, and I think it's a good idea, the possibility of turning to the public to break the tie, to solve these problems that come up in the middle. You know, one example actually that you might look at is Ireland. So it's a little bit of so in Ireland in 2016 they created something called a Citizens' Assembly, and it was just an advisory body, but they had 100 Irish citizens with a judge who was designated to be the chair. The 99 others were selected to balance, to reflect the society. We now have a lot of experience in creating what we call small publics. So it's not just random. It's that you want to make sure that you start with a random selection of people, but then you adjust to make sure that you get people, you're reflecting gender balance, different parts of the country, things like this. So this is what they did in Ireland. And they asked these people, what do you think about certain aspects of the political system, presidential or parliamentary? What do you think about major social issues like abortion? And those people had a vote. Those people came up with proposals that then were put to the Irish public. The Parliament put them to the Irish public, and the Irish public changed some major things that way. They overturned the ban on abortion through this mechanism by an overwhelming vote, by 60% vote. And the idea came from the public itself, not from the politicians, but the politicians were kind of a channel. So I think those kind of models, those ways of using the public as a deadlock breaker, could be very good. Of course, it has to be very carefully structured. But if the people have strong views on something, you can imagine the Constitutional Convention asking some questions in an advisory way in the middle of the process. Wouldn't be crazy. There's another role, of course, for the public, which is outside the formal process. And sometimes in constitution-making situations, you have the public returning to the street if things aren't going well. In Tunisia, the first draft of their constitution had a provision about women which said women shall assume an equal role in society consistent with their duties in the family. Now, Tunisia is a country which is the most progressive country in the Arab world for women, but it also had an Islamist party, and so they disagreed on this. And Tunisia's women came to the streets when that draft was released, and the Constituent Assembly changed its drafting. So that's another channel. Not a desirable, you don't want to have to get to that, but it is important to remember again that the public is a kind of constraint at the end of the day. Let me turn to my last topic. What might you do? What might you put into this Constitution? Well, here it's important to remember that a Constitution is just a piece of paper, right? It cannot automatically redistribute wealth. It cannot, solve social problems on its own. We must be realistic about what a Constitution can do and cannot do. I sometimes like to talk about constitutions as four kinds of pieces of paper. You can be an operating manual. Like, to run this computer, I look in the manual and it tells me how to run things. And that's sort of the description of the political system and how it operates. It's an operating manual. It tells us how to run our government. Sometimes constitutions are billboards. They're advertisements. They're telling us something about the society, whether or not they actually work. And sometimes they are window dressing, we say, a paper curtain that blocks out what's actually happening in the society. They're lies. But the final piece of paper is that sometimes a constitution is a blueprint. A blueprint. What's a blueprint? A blueprint, of course, is the architectural drawing. When you draw the blueprint, the building isn't built, but it tells you how to build it. And the idea is that the Constitution can set some things in there which guide our society to where we want to go, which guide our politicians and our state institutions in what they ought to do. And this is the way I like to think about it, that a good Constitution will be both an operating manual but also a blueprint. Will tell us where to go, but also how to run the machine to get there. Now, there's many trends around the world in terms of things that might go in there. But I want to just say one word, and this will be my last comment, about how to deal with the rising social demands around the world, social and economic demands. You know, 20 years ago or 30 years ago when South Africa was writing its constitution, there was an answer. When Colombia was writing its constitution, there was an answer. Social and economic rights. And certainly there's much room for expanding beyond Article 19 of the current Chilean constitution in terms of the rights that are in there. But there's also a very active literature on whether rights are the right way to think about this. And in Latin America, we have a very interesting literature on rights to health and, you know, what courts can do. If you think about it as a right, you're thinking about courts. And we have some, frankly, bad examples of courts getting involved in individual cases. Brazil is a pretty good example there. So how can we improve on the social bargain in a way that that doesn't lead to the pitfalls that we've seen in some other countries? One thing you might think about is a technology that we call directive principles. A directive principle. It's found originally in the Irish Constitution and famously in the Indian Constitution of 1949. What's a directive principle? It says that the state shall pursue social equality, or a state shall implement a right to health. So it's an instruction to the state, but not necessarily an individually justiciable right. And you might say, oh, that could be meaningless, but it's not meaningless. It recognizes that these social goods are not something that can be dealt with on an individual level, as an individual right before a court, and it deals with a certain tension in academic literature about the role of rights in a democracy, right? That when you say something's a right, you're taking it out of the democratic realm. If something is an instruction to the legislature to pass a law giving a right to health, then you're putting it back in the democratic realm. And that's something I think is a very attractive technology, which is now increasingly used, but is not, might be something to think about. Well, I know that there will be many other issues that will be discussed. But, and of course, as I say again, it is a narrow bridge. It's not going to be an easy road. There's many possible pitfalls in the process. But I'm hopeful that with the assets that you have and with the sense of momentum, that it can be sustained and that we will be celebrating a new constitution for Chile within 2 years. And I'll stop there.
Bueno, me toca a mí comentar lo que Tom acaba de presentar. Quiero dar las gracias por la excelente síntesis que ha hecho en un debate que para nosotros no tiene la connotación académica que suele tener este tipo de debates. Voy a hablar solo por 10-15 minutos para dejar tiempo, porque hay muchas preguntas que todos tenemos. Esto, Tom, are you listening well with the translation? Because, okay. Voy a hablar en castellano porque, bueno, la mayor parte del público habla ese idioma, pero voy a hablar lento para que Tom, porque hay preguntas que tengo para él. Y yo quisiera plantear, me pareció muy bien que Tom nos recuerde los acervos, las cosas que tenemos para enfrentar este proceso, los assets, y también las dificultades. Este estallido social ha crispado mucho el ambiente en Chile, ha traído esperanzas a mucha gente, pero también mucho miedo a otras, y miedo que está dividido más bien, yo diría, Los grupos conservadores tienen mucho miedo, los grupos mayores de cierta edad tienen más miedo, hay divisiones generacionales y también políticas. Un muy cercano político, Claudio Rego, decía que había dos miedos que él había detectado en estas semanas. Un miedo era la violencia desbocada, que había muchos saqueos e incendios de propiedades, a veces de gente humilde que tiene negocios en lugares, digamos, que han sido poco defendidos por la fuerza pública, y por otro ha habido desproporcionado uso de la fuerza por la policía, que ha incluso violado derechos humanos. Pero Claudio decía que había miedo al desorden, una suerte de pulsión jovesiana, y miedo a que no pase nada. Ese era el otro gran miedo. O sea, una suerte de desesperanza aprendida, como se hablaba en los años 80, de que nuevamente no va a pasar nada, ni en lo social, ni tampoco en lo constitucional o en otros ámbitos. Nuestro proceso constituyente entonces parte en este contexto. No tiene mucho sentido llorar sobre leche derramada. Cuando Bachelet presentó este proyecto de nueva constitución se dijo, ¿para qué? Si no hay crisis. Y ahora se dice, cuando hay crisis no es bueno cambiar la constitución, o es más complicado. El hecho es que en estas circunstancias estamos. Tenemos el problema de que el acuerdo no fue completo. Y no fue completo porque parte de la izquierda, el Partido Comunista y parte del Frente Amplio, tienen una idea de asamblea constituyente que es mucho más parecida a la noción de un poder que no reconoce límite alguno, un poder constituyente totalmente libre, y una idea, yo diría, quizá como muy desconfiada de los partidos, al punto de que solo una convención enteramente hecha independiente sería legítima. Esa es y no están tan solos, hay muchas personas que piensan eso, solo una asamblea enteramente hecha de independientes sería perfecta. Hay sectores conservadores que dicen que como estallido social precedió al proceso constituyente, el proceso constituyente estaría viciado, habría sido originado en un momento de violencia. Olvidan que la Constitución del 80 nació después de un golpe de Estado que es mucho más violento, pero es una consideración que también se dice. Pero el tema de la seguridad pública, del orden público, es muy práctico, Tom. La pregunta que muchos se hacen es, si la policía hoy día no puede controlar que no haya saqueos e incendios de locales, ¿qué pasaría si el día de la elección en abril, ese mismo ejército que en Chile custodia los lugares de votación, se viera sobrepasado por momentos de violencia? Estamos ante algo que para muchos en Chile es sorprendente, la incapacidad de nuestra policía de ser efectiva por un lado y de no violar derechos humanos por el otro. El gobierno ha pedido asesoría a países como Inglaterra, España y Francia para efectos de manejo de violencia en las calles. Pasando a otro problema, quisiera concentrarme en los 2 tercios. Una de las cosas importantes de este acuerdo es que se habló de una hoja en blanco y de 2 tercios para que y hay una ambigüedad, 2 tercios para que cada cláusula sea parte de la Constitución o 2 tercios para que el paquete constitucional entero sea aprobado. La hoja en blanco fue clave porque no era tolerable que de no haber acuerdo rigiera la Constitución de Pinochet. Eso no era tolerable. Pero la pregunta de qué pasa, tú hacías muy buenos argumentos de por qué es una mala idea de cada cláusula 2 tercios. Está muy bien lo que planteaste. El problema es que si no se llega a 2 tercios de acuerdo en el paquete entero, falla el proceso constituyente y rige la Constitución de Pinochet. Entonces, también hay una situación compleja para los que queremos una nueva Constitución, porque no quisiéramos que porque no se llegó a 2 tercios de acuerdo en el paquete completo, el default position, la posición, digamos, de base, es la Constitución de Pinochet de nuevo. Entonces, ahí quisiera ver si tú tienes alguna idea de un punto intermedio, algo que no sea 2/3 para el paquete entero o 2/3 para cada cláusula constitucional. Y otro problema que tenemos es bastante complejo. Partidos que estuvieron de acuerdo que firmaron este documento de acuerdo de paz y nueva constitución, al día siguiente declararon que están en contra de una nueva constitución. Entonces tenemos el comité técnico, y conozco un jurista, Arturo Fernández, que sé que odia la idea de una nueva constitución, ama la actual constitución, pero está en el comité técnico para discutir una nueva constitución. Es complejo, es como dormir con el enemigo, como dicen, no quiero decir que seamos enemigos, adversarios, pero es complejo tener en un comité técnico para una nueva constitución, o incluso, pensémoslo mirado de afuera, un acuerdo de paz y nueva constitución con partidos que al día siguiente, particularmente pienso en la UDI, salvo Belolio y un par de otros diputados, que anuncian que van a llamar a votar que no a la nueva constitución y que tienen por lo menos, a un importante jurista con mucha solvencia técnica, que yo solo puedo esperar que va a intentar que fracase ese comité técnico. En un ambiente que ya está crispado, es complejo. Después quisiera abordar el tema de los acuerdos. Para mucha gente que nos escucha o que están en las calles y que quiere nueva constitución, la palabra acuerdo se transformó en una mala palabra porque se asociaba a acuerdos espurios de grupos que estaban influidos por el lobby o el tráfico de influencia. El ejemplo más duro ocurrió hace 8 años y no le tomamos el peso, cuando un grupo de empresas pesqueras fueron al segundo piso del Parlamento a mirar que los senadores a los cuales habían financiado votaran para extenderles un enorme beneficio económico. Y ese fue solo el ejemplo más grosero de acuerdos políticos hechos por partidos políticos en un contexto de un lobby desatado, en algunos momentos, no digo que haya ocurrido para toda la legislación. Entonces, es complejo porque el hecho de que haya habido un acuerdo de partidos políticos para muchos ciudadanos chilenos es una sospecha de que aquí algo está mal. Y eso es lo que ocupa el Partido Comunista, creo yo, y sectores del Frente Amplio, que son la izquierda, más de izquierda en Chile, que explotan esa desconfianza. Dicen, si lo acordaron los partidos políticos, si estaba el partido de Pinochet, la UDI, en ese acuerdo es sospechoso. Entonces son cosas que yo creo que son los constreñimientos, la parte que no es el asset, no los acervos. Y finalmente tenía una pregunta para ti, para dejar espacio para que todos pudiéramos preguntar, que tiene que ver con esto. Tenemos poca evidencia empírica, y tal vez tú tengas buena evidencia empírica, de cuál es la evolución de la inversión nacional y extranjera y del crecimiento y de la inflación durante procesos constituyentes. Como son largos, como duran 1 año y medio o 2 años, no tenemos evidencia empírica y los economistas nos están diciendo cuánto tiempo resiste alguien que quiere invertir la incertidumbre constitucional. Por eso sería muy útil saber si hay investigaciones empíricas que digan, bueno, miren, bajo Sudáfrica, que duró 2 años y medio, la evolución de la inversión fue tal o cual, la evolución del crecimiento fue tal o cual. Quizá tampoco se pueda extrapolar porque el número de países en años recientes, en la economía actual globalizada, será en 40, 50 países, tienen distintas realidades económicas, etcétera. Entonces, no sé si exista o se puede hacer un estudio así. Hoy día hay una buena noticia, creo yo, desde el punto de vista del análisis de Sebastián Edwards, donde explica cómo le ha ido mejor en promedio a los países latinoamericanos que han hecho nuevas constituciones con asambleas constituyentes después de crear la constitución. Pero acá no tenemos muy claro que vaya a tener éxito siquiera el proceso. Y finalmente, ahora sí que termino, yo creo que es muy útil el ejemplo que pusiste de Islandia para nosotros, porque yo creo que hay una visión idealizada de un proceso constituyente sin partidos, como el único legítimo en Chile. Y el ejemplo de Islandia que has puesto es interesante porque era proceso perfecto que terminó sin constitución nueva. Pero en Islandia no era tan grave, porque la constitución anterior no la hizo, y esto es objetivo, es complicado. Fíjense, esto es como, cuando en Chile se dice, la gente cree que es muy radical, pero piénsenlo así, es la única constitución en Chile hecha por la dictadura más criminal de nuestra historia. Suena violento, duro, pero es objetivo. El único líder que ha estado acusado de genocidio en Londres y que tuvo que decir que era demente para escapar fue Pinochet. Entonces, a diferencia de Islandia, el precio de la derrota de este proceso es muy alto. Es quedarnos con una constitución muy deslegitimada desde el punto de vista de su origen. Bueno, dejo hasta aquí mis comentarios y ahora tenemos tiempo para, de hecho, más de 55 minutos tenemos, Tom es muy generoso, para tomar preguntas, así que yo creo que aquí voy a pedirle, ahí hay una persona, Ignacio está, Guillermo. Tom pide si se pueden presentar antes de hacer la pregunta, por favor. Si pueden brevemente contar quiénes son. Maybe the other. El otro. That's the one.
Muchas gracias, Tom. Guillermo Larraín, profesor de acá del Departamento de Economía. Dos preguntas como observador imparcial. A juicio tuyo, respecto a la Constitución chilena actual, ¿cuál es su mayor debilidad? ¿Que a ti te parece que es una condición sine qua non que hay que cambiar? Porque lo que sabemos es que las constituciones tienen una inercia muy grande, hay mucho path dependence. Entonces, ¿qué crees tú que hay que evitar y que de todas formas debe ser cambiado? Y por otro lado, a juicio tuyo, ¿qué es lo suficientemente bueno como para mantenerlo en una nueva constitución, de esta constitución actual?
Let's take 2 to 3 and then vamos a tomar 2 o 3 preguntas para que sea más fácil que todos puedan participar.
Ignacio Walker de CIEPLAN, gracias profesor por su exposición. Tengo 2 preguntas. La primera, usted habló de el riesgo de incoherencia, the risk of incoherence, ¿no? De ir votando cláusula por cláusula, provision by provision. ¿Cuál es la alternativa? ¿Qué forma de votación puede ser una alternativa, impedir ir votando cláusula por cláusula que pueda llegar, ¿no es cierto?, a cláusulas contradictorias, etcétera, etcétera, a la luz de la experiencia comparada para evitar justamente ese riesgo de la incoherencia? Y la segunda pregunta es sobre los derechos económicos y sociales, sobre todo sobre el tema de los derechos sociales, ¿no? Usted mencionó los ejemplos de Irlanda y la India, ¿no?, como formas interesantes de estos principios indicativos, en que de alguna manera la Constitución hace recaer en el Estado la misión de implementarlo. Por otro lado tenemos la experiencia de Colombia, ¿no es cierto?, el año 91, en que efectivamente se consagran derechos sociales que son de resorte de la Corte Constitucional, ¿no?, que es la que decide. Prácticamente la política pública se radica en la Corte Constitucional y está la acción de tutela para que cada ciudadano pueda pedir a un juez que declare ese derecho. Entonces, se pudiera explayarse un poco más en qué forma de protección de derechos sociales a la luz de la experiencia comparada. Entiendo que Alemania es un caso interesante también.
Una última en esta primera ronda, última pregunta.
Hola, soy Victoria Martínez, profesora de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado. Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo aprovechar este proceso de hacer una nueva constitución para construir o reconstruir la confianza de la gente en los partidos políticos y en los líderes políticos? ¿Qué mecanismos podríamos utilizar durante este proceso para construir esta confianza que creo que va a ser muy necesaria no solo para este proceso, sino también para el futuro del país?
Great. Can you hear? Thank you very much. These are great questions. So maybe I will start with the last one, actually, Professor Victoria's question. How can we regain the trust? I mean, I really think it's critical that there be ongoing sort of connection between those engaged in the process and the public. That doesn't mean that they should not do it in public necessarily, but there has to be a kind of ongoing communication of information, updates, seeking input constantly, because otherwise, 2 years is a long time in a political life, and the momentum can disappear very quickly. Actually, Iceland is a good example of momentum disappearing. That even though everyone was mobilized at the time of when they were banging the pots and pans, quickly their interest faded away. And actually it goes to one of Javier's questions about the economy. One of the reasons that their interest faded away is the International Monetary Fund gave Iceland a huge bailout, something they would never do if Iceland was in Africa or something like that. But they did it because Iceland's a rich European country connected with European economies and very easy to save. It's a tiny country. So they gave them a huge bailout, and that took the economic pressure off. And when the economic pressure was off, the public lost interest. So it's a very interesting, complicated thing. I'm not saying that I want there to be a continuing economic problem so people pay attention to the Constitution, but there has to be mechanisms, and they have to think about that in the technical commission. Turning to Guillermo's question about what's good and what's bad. I think maybe the biggest problem is the one that Javier alluded to, which is the symbolic origin of the document. And you still see that in the text, in the sense that, certain laws are more entrenched. The very long provisions about those core interests don't really reflect the voice of the people. I think it's the symbolic stuff which may be most important, and it's difficult. Just because something is symbolic doesn't mean it's easy to do. In South Africa, they couldn't agree on the preamble in their drafting group because the country was so divided. You have white nationalists, you have communists, you have all these, you have many, many different groups. In the end, what the drafting commission did was to say, they took the pastor, the preacher, and the head of the Communist Party, and they sent them into a little room and said, you guys draft the preamble, because anything you two can agree on, the rest of us will agree on. And those people took their responsibility seriously and produced something. So I think maybe the most important things are really symbolic, expressing a new basis for the state that reflects the current social situation, and that will have some institutional consequences, but the refounding may be the most important thing from my external perspective. Now, this actually relates to Ignacio's question. What's the alternative to a two-thirds vote? A two-thirds vote is fine, but the way that actual constitutions get made, especially in a relatively large body of 150-something people, is not that everyone is debating everything on the floor. And this is where the party system becomes a kind of asset. Again, South Africa is very telling. Yes, they had their formal process where things were openly debated, they had their committees, but at the end of the day, for certain crucial things, they had to have side meetings. There's actually a good film about it. Just as there's a great film about Chile's constitution, the great film No, I think it's called No?
Yeah, for the plebiscite.
Yeah, about the plebiscite. There's also a film about South Africa's process, and it's about Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, and the negotiator for the Nationalist Party, and their meeting, the two of them in a room, to try to resolve the problems. So a two-thirds vote is easy if the parties come up to agreement in advance. That's why you have parties, to bring the votes along with them. So I don't think a two-thirds thing is hard, but it does require that no one play the veto game, and obviously it makes this election of October, if that's how the people choose to go, extremely crucial, a critical election. And so what is going to determine that they actually come to agreement? Pressure from the public and the idea of no alternative. In South Africa, there was no going back. In Tunisia, there was no going back. In Chile, as Javier has said, there is a possibility of going back. And so that's the great risk, is that the momentum doesn't remain, and that a group decides to block. And the only thing that they will be afraid of is the punishment at the polls. So that's why mobilization through this electoral process, I think, is really critical in order to get across the bridge.
Bien, tenemos tiempo para más preguntas. por allá atrás, a ver si tiene... A ver, partamos por allá para hacerlo más fácil. La última persona que está... Y después vamos a...
Mi nombre es Rayén Condesa, soy profesora de la Universidad Católica y miembro de la Comisión de Convivencia de la Rectoría de la Universidad. Y mi pregunta, muchas gracias por su conferencia muy interesante, tiene que ver con si en su experiencia conoce usted ciertos criterios en los cuales se propusieron representación regional de las distintas regiones de un país, en el entendido de que nuestro país es muy centralizado, muy centralista desde todo punto de vista. Entonces, ¿cómo la riqueza y esa diversidad de las propuestas de distintas regiones podría ser considerada?
Por allá, aprovechemos que al fondo hay alguien. Vamos a cubrir a todo el mundo. Hay tiempo.
Hola, buenos días. Soy Luis Olivares, ingeniero en minas. Me gustaría consultar que no me quedó muy claro, a pesar de que comentó Tom respecto a Islandia por la incertidumbre económica, si podemos hablarlo así, de cuando ocurren procesos constituyentes. No sé si entregó mayor evidencia de lo que ha ocurrido en otras partes del mundo respecto a la Constitución y qué ocurre con el sistema económico.
Finalmente aquí.
Hola, Marcos Sangüesa, ingeniero civil industrial, y tengo la siguiente pregunta. Respecto precisamente de este concepto de los 2/3 para incluir cosas en la nueva Constitución, y de la posibilidad de vetar ciertas cosas y que por lo tanto quedan para ley simple. Obviamente la ley simple, como mencionaba Tom, es muy fácil o eventualmente conveniente para una posición política que cree que va a llegar al poder posteriormente, de dejar materias fuera de la Constitución y poder atenderlas con ley simple, teniendo cierta mayoría en el Congreso eventualmente. Y por lo tanto, ¿qué ejemplo de Constitución, independiente del trasfondo que tenga, pero a nivel de tópicos, que se haga cargo de un rango amplio de aspectos que una Constitución sí debería incluir, deberíamos tal vez nosotros tomar como ejemplo? Más allá de copiar las posturas, sino de decir, oye, salud, recursos naturales, derecho, forma del gobierno, etcétera. ¿Qué ejemplo de Constitución dirías tú, Tom? Es bastante amplio en alcance y puede ser un buen punto para decir, bueno, ok, deberíamos hacernos cargo a nivel constitucional de todos estos aspectos, independiente del enfoque que le demos. Muchas gracias.
Great, thank you for these questions. So, to start with, let's see. So about the regional representation. So there's two issues. One is regional representation in constitution-making bodies. That's taken care of here in Chile, but in other countries where you have big regional divides, that is the central cleavage, the central way of organizing the body is to make sure that each region is represented. So, but I take your question to be what can be done to fix the current situation of a highly centralized process. And certainly there has been a great trend around the world towards decentralization in governance generally and in constitutions specifically. And I think this is an area where the current constitution is problematic. There much more should be done to allow local people to have a voice in terms of what they're doing and where their resources are going. Now, there's two issues. There's powers and then there's the fiscal side of it, right? So you can devolve powers pretty easily, but those are only effective if the local and regional governments have their own fiscal base, their own possibility of raising revenue. And in a country where you have unequal distribution, you also need some kind of mechanism for redistribution of the wealth. And often that is spelled out in a constitution, quite specifically, because of the risk that it wouldn't be done through the ordinary politics. So that would be a great area for consideration here. Professor Olivares, or Mr. Olivares said, asked again about Javier's question about what's going to happen to the economy. You know, it's a great question and there's been no research on it. I have a paper that I started, which I haven't finished, which is called it's called The Costs of Constitutions. The costs of making constitutions. Well, there's direct costs, you know, you have to have a constituent assembly and that's cost you something. But there's also costs in terms of the institutions that are introduced. So most constitutions nowadays, most new constitutions introduce new institutions. A trend in governance is to move away from the model of 3 branches of government, the Montesquieu model of legislator, executive, and judiciary, to add new bodies, special bodies that we call the 4th branch of government, to control the other ones. So a counter-corruption commission or an ombudsman or a human rights commission. These bodies are increasingly constitutionalized. There's also the trend towards decentralization I just mentioned. And those things often have actual costs, that the budget of government will rise after a new constitution relative to before, because there's more bodies and more demands that have been met from the society and such. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's what I was looking at. Now you guys are asking me about yet another question. What happens to foreign investment and growth during this period? I haven't looked at it, but I think it's a great question. So I'll do that and I'll report back as soon as I can learn something. Now, finally, this question about punting to the future, or I shouldn't use that term, about what I call deciding not to decide. Sometimes in these bodies you have issues which you just can't agree on. And so sometimes it's very good to let them go to the future. And there's various ways of doing that. One way is to just remain silent on a topic. In South Africa, after apartheid, the African National Congress was very interested in human rights. So they wanted to abolish the death penalty. But the problem was that in South Africa, as in almost everywhere, the death penalty is pretty popular. And if they had done that, the people would have thought they were out of touch. So they debated, and they just couldn't come to agreement. So they decided, just be quiet about it. And what did that mean? The very first case before the new Constitutional Court, after the Constitution was passed, was about the death penalty. And the Constitutional Court said, we have to abolish the death penalty. So, well, if you just look at that on the surface, you might say, oh, it's a judicial activism or something like that. But actually, that was the idea the entire time. Remaining silent can allow, when you're silent on something, you push it to the future political process or the courts. Now, another way is to be very abstract in your language. We know if you're negotiating a contract that sometimes you can't come to agreement about something. So one strategy is just to be vague. And that's also a way of pushing it to the future. And generally that means that you're giving it also to the courts. But there's a third way that constitutions proceed, which is to write clauses that say this issue will be decided by law. And in that situation, you're not leaving any discretion about whether to regulate it. You're saying that it must be regulated, but you would do that if you don't really know all the details or how to do the regulation. You let the future legislature decide. And that's a very appropriate thing to do. You know, in your region, a good example is Brazil. In 1988, they had a very public constitution, very thick document because of all the public input. And it has many, many clauses that say the legislature will do this or that. They even constitutionalized the interest rate, the rate of interest for banks. But many of these things had to be adopted by ordinary law. And one thing they did not do very much of is put time limits on those laws. So to this day, there's never been a law in Brazil saying that there's an interest rate of X percent. They never passed it. But what they were trying to do is give that to the legislature, meet the public demand. If they really wanted to have the legislature do the law, they would say it must be done by this date. And that's a dimension I didn't yet talk about, but the role of time in the constitutions. You can use what we call, you could have deadlines by which the thing must be decided. You could have provisions in the Constitution which don't take effect for a certain amount of time. We call these sunrise provisions. So in other words, after the Constitution is passed, the rule doesn't operate, but it might operate after the first election, something like that. Sunrise provision, something that starts later. And finally, if you think you have the answer to something, but you're not really sure, you might do what's called a sunset provision. a provision of law or something in the Constitution that says this will be the rule for 10 years. And then the public can decide, or then the legislature can renew it, or whatever. But that's that's an idea which requires the ongoing political input. And it's good if you're not really sure you have the right answer. It's a way of getting parties to have agreement too. Because if one party thinks that they're going to lose, but they know the loss is only temporary, they might be more willing to adopt it. I should just say on this general point about provisions ending, expiring, sunsets, the famous American founding father, Thomas Jefferson, had the view that no constitution nor any law should last more than 19 years. Every law should have a sunset of 19 years. And why? Well, because he thought that the dead should never govern the living. We should never be governed by people who are gone. And after 19 years, according to the life expectancies of the time, a new generation would be in place. And so he said, every time there's a new majority, they must re-adopt the old laws if they want to keep them, or they can do something new. And that was a very radical idea. Of course, it was rejected by our country, though many American states have that rule that they must call a constitutional convention every 20 years. And so it's an interesting idea. I think probably 19 years is too short. As I said in my presentation, that's the average expected lifespan of a constitution. That's probably too short. But it's also the case that constitutions shouldn't last forever. And so particularly when we're not sure about an answer, or we think there's going to be some social change, having a sunset provision would be a good tool for the toolkit of the Constitutional Convention here.
Okay, we have more questions. The microphone here, please. First, well, let's have there, and then...
Hola Tom, hola Javier. En Chile la división entre políticos y empresarios está dividida por una línea muy difusa. Muchas veces se utiliza la economía como un elemento de amenaza ante protestas sociales, ante huelgas, ante muchos elementos así, por lo menos por parte de la población en general, es sentido así. Entonces, la pregunta era, una de las dos preguntas, es que existe algún ejemplo de constitución nacida en un periodo agitado como este, donde existe una desigualdad económica tan grande como en Chile, donde la persona que gana más gana, es muy grande la distancia. Y lo segundo es que, como decía Javier, hay un grupo que está en contra de esta constitución, pero que va a ser parte del proceso para elegir constituyentes. ¿Cómo se puede prevenir que ese 20% que no quiere una constitución nueva quede sobre representada, considerando que para elegir estos constituyentes se va a utilizar un modelo similar al de elección parlamentaria, que ya tiene una sobre representación de los grupos más acaudalados dentro del Parlamento?
Alfredo quería hacer una pregunta.
Alfredo Joañán, profesor de la Universidad Diego Portales e investigador principal del Coes. Son dos preguntas extremadamente breves, pero me temo que la respuesta va a ser larga. En Chile hay fuerzas políticas relevantes que están no solamente hablando de cambio de constitución, sino de cambio de régimen político, me refiero. Y de hecho, si uno ve Twitter, es bien chistoso, es divertido, porque esto es como una subasta. Y ha ganado cierta popularidad la idea de transitar a un régimen semipresidencial a la francesa. Yo la pregunta que me hago es, esa decisión de cambio de régimen, ¿es una decisión inicial de la Asamblea o se va construyendo al calor de la dinámica de la futura Asamblea redactora? Esa es la primera pregunta. Y la segunda pregunta es sobre lo que decía Samuela y la sobrerepresentación, la posible sobrerepresentación de quienes no quieren cambio de la Constitución. Yo todavía no entiendo la razón de por qué se está tratando de imaginar un proceso de elección de delegados constituyentes a partir de los distritos diputacionales actualmente existentes, como un espejo, y no avanzar hacia un DUN, un distrito único nacional, dado que la Constitución no es de regiones, la Constitución es de la República. Por lo tanto, a mí me parece, no sé, es como bastante lógico que los futuros delegados constituyentes fuesen elegidos a escala de todo el país. Se verá si es en lista abierta, cerrada, eso es otra discusión, digamos.
Por ahí atrás. O por ahí.
Hi Tom, David Joffre, PhD in Politics. Básicamente, un tema que tú has mencionado es darnos un poco consejos de cómo avanzar. Me preguntaba si podíamos aprovechar ese momento que tú nos estás dando consejos para comprender mejor cómo sería el tema de las campañas. En algún momento se ha pensado y se ha discutido, sobre todo en las redes sociales, esta élite intelectual que tú mencionabas al comienzo como una oportunidad, ha estado tratando de pensar el proceso a priori, digamos. Y una de las grandes preguntas ha sido si va a haber espacio para campañas y cómo esas campañas se van a financiar. ¿Ha existido esa experiencia en otros procesos constituyentes? ¿Qué tanto la gente podría reaccionar mal ante ver campañas públicas que se asemejen mucho a la partida partidista, que es justamente lo que están tratando de rechazar en este minuto a través de este proceso constituyente? Esa es una gran pregunta que yo creo que queda un poco sin responderse en este momento.
Bien, tenemos 3 preguntas, vamos a darle la oportunidad a Tom y recogemos más preguntas después.
Great. These are tough questions. So, the question about politics and business not being separate, I'm not sure I get that. I'm not sure I hear what you're saying, but I'm not sure I have much to say in response. We do have examples of major reforms with inequality, right? So you have, Brazil was an example. Actually, it's even more unequal than Chile. But in our current moment, we don't have an example that I can think of a basically successful democracy trying to respond to inequality through new constitution. And that's why I was saying that I think it's just as 1980 was kind of a model, if you will, or an innovation. Now you have amazing opportunity to do the same. Because I think the forces that we see here in Chile are not unique to Chile, and we're going to see in many other countries. And so whether constitutions are capable of addressing the social demands is the question. And I hope you have the answer for me rather than the reverse. Now, Javier and Alfredo both asked about what about a party? What about a party that's running against constitutional reform in the process? You know, you do have Article 12 of the agreement, which I would think would be some constraint. Let's see, where is it? But, where all the parties that sign this political agreement say that they guarantee their support for any constitutional and legal reforms. So, I don't know. You might interpret that to say whatever the people's vote decides and whatever the constituent convention decides must be accepted by these parties. Maybe there will be new parties that can oppose, but these parties are politically committed to supporting, would be one facial interpretation of that agreement. But of course we know it's only, in the end, a political agreement. And this is why one thing I didn't raise, but I wonder if it's being talked about whether it would make sense to, and whether there's plans to have a kind of some legislation now to give force to this agreement, to really solidify it in stone, and that might be an opportunity. I agree that using, of course, the existing election system is a convenient thing to do, and it prevented a massive debate about having a new election system. And when we look around the world at constituent assemblies and constitutional conventions, they're elected in many ways, just like normal election systems. Sometimes they're proportional representation, which was your suggestion, that we should just allow everyone to have the same vote. Of course, it goes back to the question about decentralization. That would mean that the rural areas would have a smaller voice. Sometimes you have the reverse, where each region of the country gets an equal share. That's what they tried in Libya, and that led to the urban people having less voice. So there's no perfect way to do this, but the choice you made obviously has consequences. And one of the consequences is that it makes mobilization for this particular, let's assume that the vote goes through choosing some mechanism for an October election, it makes that absolutely crucial. In fact, if the vote comes out a certain way, it could lead to more public disaffection, because if the no parties have a majority from the very beginning, then have a blocking minority from the very beginning, the public will see a year of wasted time. And that's a very dangerous thing in the current moment. So I really think that's why it's a very delicate process you're going through. Lots of possibilities of falling off the bridge. But it does make, the answer is what to do about such parties is you must mobilize and must make clear that that's not an acceptable way forward for the country. Finally, you raised the question of semi-presidentialism, and if I understood your question, where would that be decided? Well, my understanding, that's exactly the kind of thing which the Constitutional Convention will decide, that they will have to, maybe be open to changing the political system to perhaps a parliamentary system with or changing the electoral system to proportional representation. And this is an area where, of course, there's a lot of scholarship and a lot of people studying things. My personal view is, if I was picking a random country with no history, I always say you should adopt the German system. I like the German constitutional system very, very much. It's federal, so it's decentralized. It's parliamentary, which means you don't have the problem we have of unpopular presidents staying forever. And it's got a constitutional court that's the leading constitutional court in the world, so rights are well protected. So it strikes me as a very good constitution. But of course, in this region of the world, there's a long history of presidentialism, and there's a lot of inertia in constitution making. People are reluctant to try something they never tried. Again, these things are complicated sets of institutions, and semi-presidentialism might be a good thing, particularly if you had a unifying figure, but it can also lead to gridlock itself. Parliamentarism can be good, proportional representation can be good, but we tend to think that presidential systems with proportional representation are not so good, because it leads to what we call hyper-presidentialism, a president who is too strong and able to rule, by decree. But again, we're in a very odd moment in Chile. The problem here is not a risk of democratic backsliding like we face in my country. We're at grave risk of democratic backsliding. We have a political party and a charismatic populist who don't really like democracy. And the political party sees that they're going to lose because young people don't like them at all. So their only strategy is to erode our democracy, which in my opinion they are doing. That's not the problem in Chile. The problem here is, in some sense, that the governance system is not producing results. The problem is too little governance, too little responsiveness. And that's a different problem. So what you need is a system that works. So what's going to be a more responsive system? I don't know. I tend to lean towards parliamentary systems, even if it's impossible. The problem with presidentialism is all the eggs are in one basket, as we say. And the person can be a big reformer, but also block everything as well. And so at the end of the day, it all comes back to ordinary electoral politics.
Tenemos tiempo para otra ronda de preguntas. A ver. Sí, está lleno de preguntas. Ayer.
Hola, mi nombre es Damián, soy economista. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con el dato que mencionó sobre esta esperanza de vida de las constituciones de cerca de 19 años. ¿Existe alguna evidencia o algún estudio sobre qué elementos podrían como determinar que una constitución durara menos o más tiempo? ¿Qué es lo deseable? Por ahí va la pregunta.
Hola, buenas. Gonzalo, acá de la Facultad de Economía y Negocios. Mi pregunta es netamente respecto al proceso al proceso de selección de la gente que va a participar en el proceso constituyente y la participación de la ciudadanía en esto. Generalmente el rango etario. ¿quiénes deberían participar? ¿En qué rango de edad? ¿Algún ejemplo de países? ¿Quiénes son los que más participan? ¿Cuál es la gente que está metida generando esta constitución? Y generalmente en realidad porque está saliendo ahora la posibilidad de que acá en Chile, o sea, no sé si será factible, pero que voten la gente de los 16 años. Entonces, igual es como, pero hay gente que no apoya esto porque dice que no están capacitados hasta el momento, hay otra gente que dice que está mucho más capacitado que algunos adultos. ¿Algún consejo?
Great.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Bruno Areo, soy practicante de la Fundación Heinrich Böll. Quería preguntar qué constituciones en el mundo incluyen hoy en día la protección del medio ambiente y de la fauna, y cómo lo hacen. Estamos hablando hablamos de si ciertos temas son derechos o son metas del Estado que están escritas en la Constitución. Yo conozco el ejemplo de Alemania, que ellos no tienen los derechos a la protección del medio ambiente y la fauna, sino que lo tienen como una meta estatal, lo que incluye que no pueden ser, que no se puede ir a juicio, uno no puede pedirlo como un derecho, sino que es simplemente una meta que tiene el Estado. ¿Cuáles son los ejemplos a nivel mundial y cómo podríamos hacerlo mejor hoy en día en Chile?
Tomemos una más que está al lado, la persona.
Sí, Tom me explicaba en su exposición que es importante en los procesos de elaboración constitucional la incorporación de personas marginadas. Yo trabajo como voluntario en una fundación que hace trabajo en cárceles y me parece importante qué experiencia existe de participación de personas privadas de libertad que en teoría no deberían estar privadas de sus derechos ni civiles ni políticos, ni desde la participación en elecciones y referéndum. En Chile tenemos la extrañeza de que el CERVEL ni Gendarmería han logrado la coordinación suficiente para que puedan votar a aquellos que no han perdido ciudadanía, o sea, privación de derechos por parte del Estado. Y tampoco tendríamos, ni de aquí hasta el plebiscito ratificatorio, la posibilidad de extenderle la ciudadanía a estas personas que hoy día, de facto, terminan siendo privadas de derechos que no constan en la sentencia penal, como es la participación política en la sociedad.
Okay, great. So many good questions. I don't know much about that last question. I haven't looked around. Of course, in Europe, it is considered, in the European Court of Human Rights, prisoners must have political rights. So in any European country, they have that right. In my country, we have the opposite, and we even disenfranchise people, in some cases, for a lifetime if they committed for a felony. So that's obviously against human rights. So I'm sympathetic, but I don't have concrete information. On the environmental question, it's of course a great trend around the world to recognize the crisis that we are in, to now recognize climate change. So we're now seeing the very first constitutions that talk about climate change and provide a duty for the state to mitigate the effects of climate change. So not just a symbolic kind of statement, but actually making the state address to the extent they can. And I think that's very important. Coming from a country that's very backward on that issue. There's various ways to do it. One is to treat the environment through sort of what I was calling a directive principle, an order to the state to do X or Y. And another is to create an actual right to environmental protection, or a right to a clean environment. And we see that in many countries. Actually, Ecuador is kind of the leading example here, because it not only creates environmental rights, which have been litigated in its courts, but even creates a right to what they call the Pachamama. The Mother Nature herself has rights. It's unusual. Usually we think human beings have rights, or maybe animals. But Mother Nature herself has rights, and anyone can bring a claim on her behalf in court, and they do. So that's a very, very progressive one, I guess you'd say. But I think it would deserve careful study in terms of what works and what doesn't. The combination of what to have a right that courts can deal with versus what should be just an order to the state, and that's certainly a trend. On the question about election, about how to get election for citizens, I think it was. I'm trying to remember.
Independence.
Yes. Well, so for independence, I see. Yeah. Was that the question?
Independiente.
He was asking about youth. I can answer that. So you were asking about young people specifically. And obviously young people are, the future. And so in principle, these lines that we draw about age are very artificial. We know that if you say 18 or 21, there are going to be some people who are older than 21 who don't have much capacity, and some people who are younger who do have a lot of capacity. And I think we're in an era where young people have a lot of capacity. Anyone who is my age knows that if they have a problem with their phone, they have to go to someone like her age, someone young. And so, we're at a time when knowledge is being reversed, and so I'm in principle in favor. But I also am in favor of having marginalized groups have special seats in the constituent body, because that gets people engaged. If there's one person in the body who is a representative of youth, well, then that person can help, provide the input of what the youth want. But equally important is that that person can also communicate to the marginalized communities what is going on within the constitution-making body that's relevant to them. And the flow of information has to be two ways. So I do like special representatives for the disabled, for youth, etc. I think it's important. Finally, a very good question on what makes constitutions last a long time. I've written on this question. So looking at all constitutions, we've come up with 3 factors that seem to help a constitution last a long time. The first is whether or not it's produced in an inclusive process. If you have more people involved, then people know about it, they care about it, and those constitutions do last longer. They might be harder to produce. The probability of getting a constitution might be harder if you're very inclusive, because you have more people that have to agree. You can't just have some backroom deal. But it does mean that those constitutions last a long time. Second factor, flexibility. And this is something where the Chilean constitution was not very flexible originally. There was all these 4/7 laws and things like that. And flexibility is important because it allows you to change the constitution when there's a new change in society. Societies are always changing. And if you don't have a flexible constitution, then you might be in trouble. The constitution might break instead of bending and adjusting. And the third thing that we learned, actually, that predicts a long-lasting constitution is what we call specificity, detail. A lot of detail in a constitution actually helps the constitution to last a long time. And that's very surprising to people, particularly Americans, because we have a short, very vague constitution and have this idea that only important things should go in there. But in fact, detail is important. It tells us a lot of things. If the constitution you guys get through this process, the draft, if it has a lot of detail, it tells us some things. It tells us that the parties could actually agree. They were working with each other to hammer out detail. They weren't leaving things silent. They weren't being abstract. They're being very precise about what they're producing. That's a sign that they could agree, which means also that they invested energy into the document. And when someone comes along to propose a new constitution, they will say, no, we worked hard on this. It has the things we wanted. It might also be the case that particular groups get advantages through details. So interest groups. In Mexico, which has a very old constitution, the article on labor is extremely long. It's 4 or 5 pages long. And they change it all the time because the unions are very powerful, and particularly under the PRI system, that political party that ran Mexico for so long. Labor was important. And whenever they wanted to give labor something to keep them happy, they would change the constitution. And you might say, well, that's bad because it's an interest group thing which should be done in ordinary politics. But from the point of view of the constitutional endurance, it's actually a good thing because it means the powerful groups in society and maybe even the marginalized groups in society see themselves in that document and they want it to be sustained and they want it to last. So interestingly, all those features, flexibility, specificity, inclusion, are the exact opposite of what we have in my country, which was, constitution produced by 50 people who were slave owners and in a very vague way. So we're an exception in this case. But if you take that out of the database, then you really find that these things do work.
Bueno, hemos llegado a la última ronda de preguntas. Tenemos 3 preguntas. Sabemos que hay mucha gente lamentamos, ha habido mucho interés. Ok, vamos a dejar que las personas que tienen el micrófono decidan.
Hola, mi nombre es Sofía Rivera y mi pregunta es sobre la ambigüedad constitucional, que tiene que ver con esta estrategia de escribir ciertas cláusulas de manera más abstracta, y aunque siento que la mayoría de las constituciones tienen cierta ambigüedad hasta cierto punto, hay casos extremos, como especialmente en sociedades divididas como en España, que causan bastantes problemas, como el reconocimiento del Estado de las autonomías, como cláusulas importantes en que pueden surgir interpretaciones bastante distintas y causar problemas en el largo plazo. Entonces me preguntaba si en la coyuntura específica de Chile, ¿cómo evalúas el riesgo de que surjan partes demasiado ambiguas? Y si esto es un verdadero riesgo o si la mayoría de los países pueden funcionar bien con constituciones con puntos medio ambiguos. Eso.
Hola. Hola a todos. Manuel Valdivia, estudiante de la Universidad de Santiago. Mi pregunta va relacionada a las probabilidades de éxito de un cambio constitucional, el cual creo que en el caso de una democracia radica en la legitimidad ciudadana y no en el liderazgo autoritario, como ha sido gran parte de las constituciones que se impusieron acá en Chile, y la relación que tiene la posibilidad de éxito, dado que radica en la legitimidad ciudadana, al existir una deslegitimización hacia las fuerzas de orden de la ciudadanía. De hecho, había un cambio, o no sé si un cambio, pero una integración entre las demandas ciudadanas que ha sido la sensación y las demandas que se han dado respecto a abusos por parte de la policía, y no sé, eso también de parte explica por qué el oficialismo de cierta manera pensaba que se iba a desactivar la calle con el cambio de constitución de cierta manera, pero las movilizaciones siguen, se ha integrado esta nueva consigna del actuar de las fuerzas de orden. Entonces, ¿cuál es la variable, o sea, de qué tanto, cuál es la relación entre las variables de la posibilidad de éxito del cambio constitucional con la variable de la deslegitimización hacia las fuerzas de orden público?
La última pregunta, porque tenemos que ir cerrando en unos minutos.
Hola, soy Juan Rivera, sociólogo mexicano y magíster en Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Chile. En cuanto al tema de la Asamblea Constituyente de la Ciudad de México, yo creo que más bien fue como de trasfondo algo como para legitimar la constante decaída de la aprobación en el gobierno de Mancera y también de Enrique Peña Nieto en el 2017 rumbo a las elecciones del 2018. Entonces, para mí más bien fue un gesto político que una intención verdadera de cambiar la Constitución, ya que es más bien una reforma a la Constitución, y tomando en cuenta que la Ciudad de México es una entidad federativa, no es un estado como tal. Entonces, sí se rige bajo su propia normativa, pero también toma en cuenta la Constitución Política de los Estados Unidos Mexicanos de 1917, que de hecho fue pensada, construida y planificada durante la Revolución Mexicana, que no terminó en ese año, que ni siquiera hay vestigios de que haya terminado una vez que se proclamó la Constitución. Entonces no hay ni siquiera un acuerdo de cuándo, pero surgió en tiempos violentos. Lo importante acá es que ¿qué es lo que vino después? Las reformas a dicha Constitución fueron lo que promulgaron cambios verdaderamente importantes para el país. Por ejemplo, en 1937 se expropió petróleo, se fundó Pemex, que se considera un gran paso hacia la nacionalización del combustible. De la misma manera, en 1960, con la Comisión Federal de Electricidad, una de las más grandes en América Latina, al ser nacionalizada, de esta forma se bajaron los costos de producción y por lo tanto nosotros tenemos gastos menores en electricidad, en combustible y en agua, uno de los servicios que son básicos y que son considerados como derechos básicos en México. Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿de qué manera se puede pensar en base a la construcción de una nueva constitución en Chile que exista una continuidad y una auditoría al futuro de la Constitución? ¿De qué manera se puede auditar a las futuras reformas, ya que la Convención Constituyente únicamente fue pensada para construir la Constitución, pero se va a deshacer una vez que esta sea concretada? Entonces, ¿qué mecanismos se pueden establecer dentro de esta Constitución que se va a crear para que se pueda auditar a las futuras reformas que no sabemos si van a ser a favor o en contra de los bienes nacionales?
Bien, tenemos la última respuesta de Tom y damos por cerrado el seminario.
Thank you very much for these good questions. Let me start with Ms. Rivera, the question about ambiguity. So there are certain things the Constitution must decide. What's the mechanism of selecting the president, for example? Sometimes those things are very small. I mentioned the voting rule on the first day of the legislature. If you don't resolve that, then you can't even start. So there are certain things that must be in there. But there are other things, of course, which can be left to the future in various ways. And if we're very confident that we know the right answer about something right now, and it's never going to change, then we can put it in the Constitution. Most things aren't like that. And so we leave it either to the legislature or to very vague and ambiguous language. And sometimes we have ambiguous language for political reasons because the parties can't agree, but sometimes it's for a good reason, which is we want the future generations to be able to interpret that vague language in accordance with their own society. So I think there is a role for ambiguity, for sure, and particularly when we think that there's going to be social change. Here's an example. Many constitutions have an equality clause, no discrimination on the basis of gender, of race, ethnicity, etc. Sometimes those clauses have a little small phrase where they say, or other status, or other status. Sometimes they don't have that phrase. Well, that makes a big difference. If we are confident that right now we know the exact bases on which discrimination is going to occur forever, then we would list them and they would be exclusive. But we might also want to let the future decide, so that when new forms of social life or activity come into being on which people discriminate and our understandings of discrimination change, we can adjust. So that's the example there. On policing, well, obviously a constitution doesn't itself, regulate, well, I shouldn't say that. A constitution will deal with the policing issue in two ways. First of all, there might be, I don't know that Chile is this context, but if you had a problem with the security forces generally under the old regime, you would want a mechanism of transitional justice. Transitional justice where you go through and you have people, you expose the crimes somehow, either through a legal mechanism or through some other mechanism. Perhaps more appropriate here in Chile would be to maybe constitutionalize a police commission. I don't think it's in the current constitution, where you have some body, constitutionalized body that's responsible for oversight of the police and making sure they have appropriate training. That seems quite appropriate, and that's the kind of thing we do see in many countries as a response to problems with police. And finally, very quickly on Mexico, and how do you make sure you got things right? Here, there's another technology which we see in some countries, and it's a little bit related to Thomas Jefferson. So I said Thomas Jefferson thought that all laws should expire, should just disappear. Well, you might want to take a softer approach, and that is to have a review of how the Constitution is operating after a certain period. So, for example, in Fiji, they did this, where they said, we're adopting the Constitution. In 10 years, we're going to have a constitutional commission to produce a report on the operations of the Constitution, and if appropriate, to propose reforms. So there's an ongoing discussion of how the Constitution is really working, and that's built in at the very beginning. I think that that's a good system, and I should add that sometimes that can help when you have situations of deadlock. So let's say the political forces are disagreeing about some critical topic, presidentialism or parliamentarism. this happened actually in Brazil in 1988. They were fighting. This was the main issue in their constituente, and they were fighting. And at the last minute, the presidentialists won. Presidentialistas won the battle for the vote. But in order to soften the blow and in order to pass the Constitution, they said, fine, we're going to be a presidential system, but in 5 years, we're going to have a vote among the whole public, a referendum, about whether to keep the presidentialist system, to go for parliamentary system, or actually to go for monarchy. And they did that in 1993. They did have that referendum. The monarchy didn't get that many votes, but the presidentialist system won at that second time. And I think that's what it does. That kind of mechanism helps you learn. It says, we're not 100% sure this is the right system. Let's try it out. Then we'll review. We'll have a referendum to see whether we think it's working. It allows for learning and can soften the blow for the losers. So again, it's a kind of negotiation technology.
Bueno, hemos tenido 2 horas de un recorrido panorámico de todo el mundo sobre estos procesos. Yo quiero darle muy sinceros agradecimientos a Tom por haber venido a este viaje flash, a la FEN por habernos acogido y al Coes por haber organizado esto. Así que un aplauso para Tom.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That's great.
Otherwise, they would have continued.
Oh, you mean these guys? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.